Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to welcome our speaker today in the masterclass series by Franz Slobode this year, supported by Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in their regional office. And the masterclass today will be by Professor and colleague Stefania Barca on the topic Patriarchy, Accumulation and Feminist Struggles over the Commons. I'm very glad to welcome today Stefania Barca, and I'm just going to shortly introduce you to all of introduce her to all of you. She is she's a distinguished researcher at the Department of History at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and her research interests are in environmental history and political ecology with a focus on the industrial age. She investigated hydraulic energy and the elaboration of industrial landscape between 18th and 20th century, environmental mobilizations, peasants, indigenous and workers in Italy, Brazil and Portugal from the 1970s to the present. And she's currently researching just transition from a feminist perspective with a special focus on care work. She published in international peer-reviewed journals, and her book, Enclosing Water, Nature and Political Economy in the Mediterranean Valley, published in 2010, was awarded the Turku Book Prize in 2011. And her latest book, Forces of Reproduction, Notes for a Counter-Hegemonic Anthropocene, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. She is active in feminist climate justice and degrowth networks, and her work has been translated and disseminated in several languages. So the masterclass today is going to discuss how a consistent thread in materialist ecofeminist thought has described global capitalism as the latest stage of patriarchy and women as a primary territory for capitalist accumulation, their bodies, labor and knowledge as commons to be appropriated for value production and or extraction. At the same time, women have been looked at as subjects of common struggle against commodification of the life commons, for example, air, water, soils, oceans, breast milk, etc., and in defense of their integrity, in short, as providers of earth care. Over the past 4 decades, numerous sources have pointed to women's leadership role in environmental justice, anti-nuclear, anti-militarist, and anti-extractivist mobilizations, as well as in projects of food sovereignty based on environmental care, such as urban gardening, reforestation, seed saving. More recently, indigenous and peasant, but also urban women's earth care mobilizations in Latin America are being understood as feminismo comunitario, i.e. as struggles against the violence of heteropatriarchy over the territory, body, and land nexus. Based on a feminist political ecology approach, Stefania's talk today will present the struggles for earth care as a strive for liberation from capitalist state colonization of bodies and territories. And she will explore the hypothesis that these struggles revolved around the conditions for reproductive labor, like clean air, water, healthy soil, and so on, and the relations of reproduction, that is heteropatriarchy as a regime of accumulation based on the alienation of fair labor. The masterclass today is going to have the same format as usual. Stefania will talk for about 45 minutes to up to 50 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion moderated by me. So thank you all again for joining in, and thanks to all the participants who are here today, and especially thanks to you, my thanks to you, and thanks of all from Slobode activists to you, Stefania, for accepting to do this masterclass. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yasmina, and thanks, Damir, for the invitation, and thanks to all the people who are here this evening. So I'm very excited of sharing with you these thoughts on commoning and women's struggles and feminism. These are along the lines of the work that have been done in the past few years, and that is, and you can find in my recent book and also in recent articles. I'm trying to develop this work towards deepening the understanding of the relationship between commoning struggles and feminist struggles. So let me give you, first of all, an overview of what is the general argument in my book as an introduction, let's say, to the focus on feminism and commoning. The general argument of my book, the book is it's called Forces of Reproduction: Notes for a Counter-Hegemonic Anthropocene. So the general argument is that we should look at the Anthropocene, the era of climate change, the era of Earth system changes as related to human activities. We should look at this era from a feminist perspective, and so the book argues that looking at from a feminist perspective, we can gain a better understanding of the Anthropocene, a better understanding of the deep root causes of the current climate and Earth system crisis. And the conceptual framework of the book is ecofeminist thought. And specifically, that part of the ecofeminist thought that is inspired by a socialist approach. So socialist ecofeminism, socialist or materialist ecofeminism. That is the theoretical structure that underpins my book. So, in short, ecofeminist thought has shown how the ideology of the forces of production, which is the ideology that underpins economic growth and industrial growth and capitalism over the past 300 years, this ideology originates from what the Australian philosopher Val Plumwood has called a master model of rationality, a model or master model of modernity, if you want, a model of modernity that is not only capitalist, but it is not only classist, let's say, based on class divisions. It is also patriarchal, and more specifically heteropatriarchal and racist and speciesist. So based on human supremacy over other species. So together, class, sex, gender, race, and species relations and inequality, relations of inequality, hierarchical dualisms, taken together, they form a unique system, a unique model of modernity, which is deeply enrooted in Western culture and its definition of progress, of history itself. And Mahmoud also recalled, which is something that is relevant to the focus I want to take today. She recalled how in this model, in this culture of modernity, human identity was associated with two concepts, productive labor on one side and private property. on the other side. So historically, human identity, as defined in the European modernity culture, Western modernity, the human was identified with the productive worker, with the productive work, and with private property. And this was by separating human identity from supposedly lower forms of work, for example, reproductive work or care work, that wasn't even considered as work. So excluding these forms of work from the very definition of labor and productivity. And at the same time, separating the human identity from property relations that were also considered as lower forms of property. And here we're speaking about the commons. The commons taken as the opposite of property, considered as not even considered as property. So capitalist political economy defined reproductive work as non-work or a valueless activity. But at the same time, this activity was naturalized, but at the same time, it was necessary to social reproduction. And not only that, care work or reproductive work was also necessary to capitalism itself, to sustain the master system, the capitalist system. And at the same time, the commons were redefined into waste, in the sense of value not yet realized. So something to be brought to be turned into a productive resource by appropriating it, by taking it from the realm of the commons and bringing it into the realm of private property. This was very famously John Locke's theory of property and of government. So the subject of this appropriation of reproductive work and of the commons is the master, intended as an abstraction of the model of modernity that I was mentioning before. So the master can be defined as the owner of the means of production, and also the subject of agency, the subject of history, the one who makes history by appropriating other people's work, so other people that work for the master, and by writing the law. And so the master is also the subject of the law. The law is intended to grant the master's right of property and control over other people's work and over the means of production. So, and in this vision, in this Western vision model of modernity, the wealth and human progress could only come from the master and from the master's house, figuratively speaking, and from there should trickle down to the rest. And this is the let's say a basic tenet of liberal ideology. Now, this form of modernity that identifies the master as the proper human identity and naturalizes in the realm of non-human nature everything and everyone else, This model of modernity was a product of capitalist modernity, on Western capitalist modernity, but then it also was adopted and spread to other contexts and other parts of the world and other cultures. It was imposed upon other parts of the world via colonization and imperialism. It was globalized during the era of development politics, and it was also partly maintained by forms of state socialism and the state socialist variety of industrial modernity also was premised on a master model of rationality, in which the master is the state, no? Is the state, the collective identity, the nation, and so the aim is that of increasing the productivity, the production of the system's productivity. Yeah, so in this context, the argument I develop in the book is that what a counter-hegemonic understanding of the Anthropocene consists in looking at the other than master subjects, the subjects of history that have been denied subjectivity and agency in the master model, and those who have put to work for the master, and whose bodies and also whose territories, whose land, whose means of subsistence have been constantly appropriated by the master system. And so looking at these subjects as actually agents of history, not only in resisting the master system in different ways, depending on the positionality of each, so from different points in this master system of power, but also as subjects of autonomous forms of human development, autonomous from capital, and or alternative, if you want, to capitalist development. And so this is why I call these subjects the forces of reproduction. In order to, which is a concept that I take from a socialist ecofeminist author, Mary Mellor, which is a concept that emphasizes this alter subjectivity with respect to the forces of production, this alternative subjectivity, which is centered on the production of life. The term reproduction, which is a very contested term, and because it apparently reinforces the dualism, no, between production and reproduction, which is actually fictitious. But it is maintained. It is. I think that it is useful to maintain the term for analytical terms, in analytical terms, because it allows us to point to identify the existence of a sphere of work that is not what has been commonly identified with production, a sphere of work that has been historically denied not considered as work, has been naturalized. So Maria Mies, the German sociologist, who is one of the reference authors in ecofeminist and socialist ecofeminism, She wrote that actually reproduction should be reconceptualized as the production of life, and for all subsistence production also. And by this, we should understand not only the production of human beings, but also the production and nurturing and care of human beings, but also of other forms of non-human nature, including the land or soil, food, and what we could understand as the conditions of production. And the production of these conditions of production and their and care for these conditions of production is what I understand as reproductive work. So my point is that seeing the forces of reproduction as historical subjects helps us to see these subjectivities as potential, as part of the potentially revolutionary subjectivity. So it's not only industrial workers, as orthodox Marxist theory would put it, that are the potential great diggers of capital or potential revolutionary subjects, but also the reproductive workers. With another reference author in socialist ecofeminism, Ariel Saleh, has called these subjects meta-industrial labor. So all the labor, that the subjects of all the labor that is supportive of industrial labor, or if you want, of waged labor. So you can also conceptualize this as the distinction between waged and unwaged labor. So these, in the ecofeminist tradition of thought and also of political activism, let's say, women's struggles in a variety of contexts have been understood, have been seen as forms of resistance, or let's say resistance from the kitchen table, has been called in feminist scholarship. Resistance that is centered on the defense of the conditions of production, intended as the production of life. And for example, women's active leadership in environmental justice movements, the integrity and also of public health, and also of defense also of domestic life and the health and safety of family and community. All this has been part of environmental justice struggles, which are the literature and also the data show that they are largely led by women. And so from a socialist ecofeminist perspective, we should understand this women's leadership and these struggles as labor struggles, as struggles of mega-industrial labor in defense of the conditions of production of life. And this also has been interpreted as this agency of resistance to capitalist modernity, also as struggle in defense of the commons. In fact, women have been also the forefront of struggles to defend common access or preservation of a variety of environments, natural environments, even built environments. Think, for example, of struggles around public housing in cities, or access to nature in both rural and urban contexts, and etc. No? So a number of struggles that around the commons that are typically understood by in the commons theory as forms of resistance against dispossession and against the degrading conditions for both productive and reproductive work. As Silvia Federici has written, many women, both rural and urban, have been the main social force standing in the way of a complete commercialization of nature, supporting a non-capitalist use of land and a subsistence-oriented agriculture. End quote. So another reference author in ecofeminism, Caroline Merchant, has called this particular agency earth care. Now, this concept of earth care and this connection between women and communist struggles has been also criticized as an essentialist claim. And there is a long tradition of criticism coming also from within feminist scholarship and the feminist movement itself, because of the uncomfortable nature of this nexus, no, between women and non-human nature, and care for people and care for the environment. But a number of materialist ecofeminists and like, for example, Christine Bauer have pointed out very properly that it is not an issue of the female body as to seeing the female body biologically speaking as the subject of care, labor, and of commoning struggles and environmental justice struggles, but rather the perspective is that of pointing to the division of work, the social division of work, in the sense that or sex-gender relations that have historically and socially assigned care work to women. And so by taking this perspective on the social division of work, we can understand why we find women in these kind of struggles, no? And at the very same time, we also must keep in mind that women still are the vast majority of the global reproductive and caregiving class, which is a class that in large majority is a dispossessed class. It's a proletarian class of reproductive and caregiving work, which is largely unpaid and performed under conditions of necessity rather than choice. So this is what makes reproductive and caregiving workers proletarians, and this is what, from my point of view, I think this is the perspective that will help us also looking delving into the connection between feminism and commoning, or what I would call the uneasy question of gender and property. So I want to introduce here now some problematization of this connection between gender and commoning, which is not along the lines of the critique of essentialism, which I think that I've already it's been already actually settled, but if you want, we can go back on it in the discussion. But rather, I wanted to focus on another aspect, and which is the aspect of gender violence. But let me get there. So yeah, the point of departure where I was what I was saying before, the point of departure for this perspective is that women should be seen as as forming a majority of the global proletarian class. So a class of laborers whose bodies and productive capacities have been appropriated by capital and capitalist institutions, and or by states and state institutions. So from this perspective, women's environmental agency becomes that of political subjects who reclaim control over the means and conditions of the production of life, their bodies, and think, for example, the struggles around abortion laws, no? That nowadays are really becoming very key. And control over the means and conditions of reproduction or production of life, we should include also the non-human environment or land, which is still a very essential means of production in almost half of the world and the world population. So the nexus between women and non-human nature as co-producers of labor power it's a nexus that has been socially constructed by capitalist relations of reproduction. And so women's struggles are to be seen as part of class struggle, in an eco-socialist perspective, I think that we could say, we could define the eco-socialist horizon in these terms as joining the struggles of industrial and meta-industrial workers to gain control over the means of production and reproduction. And of course, gain control over this means to use them towards realizing human freedom, but human freedom not in autonomy from non-human nature, as the master model of modernity has taught us, but human freedom intended is interdependency with non-human nature. So this is the radically new and alternative model of development of modernity that eco-socialism can represent. So going back to the focus on commoning and gender, first of all, given the premise of proletarization and reproductive work as proletarian work, then we should define and understand what exactly do we mean by commoning struggle. So I think that there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, struggles against the commodification of land, bodies, or territories. So commoning here is a struggle over the access and control over the means of production and reproduction. And the other way of looking at this is struggles against the commodification of labor itself. So commoning here is the struggle over the autonomy of reproductive work, productive and reproductive work. So in other terms, commoning opposes the proletarization, the process of proletarization intended as the separation of human and non-human nature, and the transformation of both humans and non-human nature into commodities, and so the process of capital accumulation. So commoning is what opposes this process, historically and at present, because this is a never-ending process. And as we have seen before, the women are involved in these struggles as largely in the position of meta-industrial workers. So they oppose their own dispossession from the means of reproduction, their own bodies and the land, and for example, and oppose the depletion of both bodies and land on the part of capital. And there seems to be, this claim is based on a large body of evidence and literature that shows how women in both rural and urban, peasant and working class communities are actually invested in commoning struggles and practices. Two observations, I would say, that a little bit problematize this claim. First, that access to the means of reproduction is not necessarily intended for collective property. Access to the means of production and reproduction can be a claim for individual access. Individual access, for example, to the body, but individual access to land itself also. And the second is the fact that the commons are not necessarily women inclusive. Historically speaking, the commons have been always, often excluding women, not to mention transgender people. So, so very often the commons have been only the male members of the community have been entitled to the commons in many contexts and historical periods. So there is no automatic association between commons and an inclusion of women and transgender people. So these two facts tell us that there is more to dig out to understand the relationship between gender and commoning. And I think the reason for this is also referring to the process of proletarization that I was mentioning before. The reason is that industrial and meta-industrial work, or waged and unwaged labor or workers, are not equal. They are related through power asymmetries with each other, and they are also, and these power asymmetries and this relationship between waged and unwaged or industrial and meta-industrial work are also relations are also violent relations. Some very often, no, they are also ridden with violence, domestic violence or sexist or more transphobic violence are all forms of violence that are trans class and within communities, within same communities, same class, same caste, same household, very often, no? And so this complicates the picture of women as equal members of communities of commoners, or as well as pictures of anti-capitalist struggle and of class struggle itself. As Black feminists have repeatedly argued, sexist oppression also, or very often, overlaps with race, class, caste oppression. And this creates hierarchies of power within the oppressed community. So I think that this leads to ask the question, how are commoning struggles related to struggles against sex, gender, or racial, class, or caste violence? So how are these two struggles related to each other? And I think that, as I was mentioning before, I think that we can look at this question taking as a point of departure the process of proletarization. And I want to do that by looking at proletarization from a gender perspective, by using two main reference authors in feminist scholarship, Silvia Federici and Dina Agarwal. They both point to a history of dispossession and proletarization which is specific to women. So proletarization is not the same thing if seen from a gendered perspective. And this gender difference of proletarization is largely ignored in theories of the commons. Federici considers the dispossession of women from their bodies and from their reproductive capacities as part of the process, historical process that Maria Mies called housewifeization, the transformation of women into housewives, into reproductive subjects who are excluded from wage labor and from the market and from the public sphere in general. In Caliban and the Witch, Federici offered an in-depth study of how in 17th century Europe the female body had been remade into, quote, into an instrument for the expansion of the workforce, treated as a natural breeding machine, functioning according to rhythms outside of women's control, end quote. This new sexual division of labor, she argued, had redefined proletarian women as natural resources, a sort of commons open to appropriation or enclosure for the sake of improved productivity. Capitalist patriarchy was born. Due to the parallel enclosure of land and their own bodies, women gradually lost access to subsistence means, and since their work had been expelled out of the sphere of the market, they became economically dependent on men. And so women were subhumanized in the law, enslaved in the economy, and subject to the genocidal terror of witch hunting. This whole was happening in modern Europe, early modern Europe. And this whole was related to what early modern Europe was doing at the very same time in the colonies. She also argued in some other books. She has also shown how during the 19th century industrial capitalism forced working class women into unpaid domestic work, because of course at some point the industrialization process, the industrial revolution interrupted this process of housewifeization of women, and because industrial capitalism was needed everybody to put everybody to work in the factory. So women were together with men and children were providing the labor force for the early process of industrialization. But at some point during the 19th century, industrial capitalism forced women, working class women back into unpaid domestic work through a series of laws and regulations that actually ended up denying women access to wage work. And this happened for a number of reasons that we don't have time here to expand upon, but having to do with pacifying the working class by giving the male worker his own proletarian working for him to reproduce him. So economic dependence on the male wage made women the proletarians within the household, because the value produced by their work was paid to their husbands. Their sacrifice was valuable to capital insofar as it served the scope of pacifying workers and maintaining the labor movement under control. This is the thesis that Federici but also argued. So seen in this perspective, for example, the wages for housework movement in the 70s can be seen as a women's response to this long-term historical process of housewiferization by refusing to work for free. As Selma James, one of the leaders of the movement, together with Federici herself, wrote and talked about giving women money of their own. So this was a struggle for women to get access to some to assets of their own in the form of money, as a wage or a salary for their unpaid domestic work. On the other hand, Beena Agarwal, Indian political economist, who has been very inspirational for the whole field of feminist economics and feminist development economics. In classic her book called A Field of Her Own, A Field of One's Own, a book from 1990, the mid-90s, I think, was looking at the women's struggle for land in the context of rural context of Southeast Asia. And she also demonstrated how women had been proletarianized by being denied access to land property, access or control, because sometimes women were recognized legal rights on land through inheritance law, but then the actual control over their land was demanded to the men in the family or in the community. And so, starting from this perspective, the perspective of proletarianization of women within communities, within their own households and communities, Agarwal criticized development policies and welfare policies of the post-war period that for taking the household as the reference unit of policy, ignoring and thus implicitly sanctioning the existence of asymmetries, the sex-gender difference, and power inequalities within the household. So, from a feminist perspective, struggles for individual access to land or individual control of land, or struggles for getting access to money, or struggles for defending and getting control over one's own body, must be seen as struggles to both as dual, in a dual perspective, both as a personal property, individual property, the property of land, of money, of my body, and as access and control over the means of production and of reproduction. And so these dual aspects of the struggle are can be seen as part of class struggle, because these are struggles against the proletarianization of women. In short, having been mostly excluded from owning money and property historically, women and transgender people also struggled for gaining individual access to these means, for land of money of their own, and for full control of their bodies and sexualities as means to personal freedom from male power and most frequently as means of provision for dependent others. So this gender inequality dimension is frequently lost in and potentially in tension with commoning discourse, commoning theory, because it points to the strive for personal property as a key dimension of struggle for the dispossessed. In my view, sex workers, women, transgender and sexually non-conforming people are all involved in struggles against customary rights, taboos, and rules that exclude them from the full ownership of their own bodies. If, as Federici claimed, these struggles also aimed at individual and collective autonomy from capital. And since the body is also a site of reproductive work, this autonomy includes the right to be paid for one's sexual or reproductive services. In other words, when it comes to bodies, emancipatory struggles of housewives, sex workers, or transgender non-conforming people consist in affirming individual property against society's claims over our bodies as public property to be made productive for capital accumulation. So to conclude, land, money, and the body should all be understood as means of reproduction, essential to one's livelihood and well-being. What these struggles have in common is the strive to regain states of autonomy from capital, from the wage relation which enslaves the dispossessed and turns the whole world into a territory for value extraction. And this, I argue, is why reproductive struggles are to be considered as commoning struggles, even if they are demanding things like the body or the field or money, which pertain to the sphere of personal freedom and autonomy. Nonetheless, seeing commoning struggles from an intersectional perspective leads one to consider that claims to the means of reproduction are not only against capital, but also against oppressions and violence within one's class, household, community, or caste. As Black feminism has demonstrated, these different forms of oppression are related and systemic. They are functional to maintaining society's racial patriarchal class caste structures. This demands that commoning theory comes to terms with sex, gender, and other power asymmetries that weaken the anti-capitalist potential commoners by reproducing capital's accumulation mechanisms from within.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you. I will thank you for your exciting talk. I'm really looking forward to having discussion now about the ecofeminist challenges that we have here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region. And I'm going to also help translate if anyone needs translation when it comes to discussion. I'm particularly glad that we are joined today by Maida Bilal, who is one of the leaders of big ecofeminist women's uprising defending the river against the illegal buildings of hydro plants on the rivers and destroying the whole environment and the community itself. Very inspiring movement that have galvanized a lot of other initiatives in Bosnia and Herzegovina and ordinary citizens. They're quite famous, Žene Kruščice. So she's with us today, and it would be really good if we could hear from her and her perceptions on where they are at the moment and the whole struggle. Maybe she can tell you a little bit about their work and I can translate. Majda, kao što ste čuli, predstavila sam vam se, rekla da mi je jako drago što ste tu danas s nama i da bilo jako interesantno za Stefaniju da čuje o vašim borbama i onome što su žene Kruščice uradile u Bosni i Hercegovini regionalno i braneći svoju rijeku, ali isto tako na neki način dovodeći skupa puno sličnih inicijativa i djelujući i na nivou BiH i regionalno, pogotovo u smislu onoga što ste postigli i onoga što planirate u budući. Pa tako rekao sam, ako je potrebno, mogu prevoditi, a samo polako.
Da, kako sam uvijek ranije govorila, da feminizam, aktivizam, pogotovo ovaj aktivizam u domenu ekologije i javnih dobara, u Bosni i Hercegovini je nekako jako teško pokrenuti na način onako kako ja to vidim i moji suborci.
Okay, Maida just said that that she sees a lot of challenges ahead when it comes to feminism in the domain of ecology and the defense of the commons and public goods in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially in the sense of how she sees it together with her comrades, so to say, together with other women who are with her in the field.
Ali naš slučaj u Kruščici i otpor žena na tom mostu, koji smo i nazvali po 23 uhapšene osobe, od toga su 22 žene i 1 muškarac. Mislim da je to bio neki spontani, iznenadni događaj sa veoma ružnim ekscesom, gdje smo fizički napadnuti, da je pokrenuo mnoga pitanja, ali i potakao druge zajednice koje imaju isti ili sličan problem u Bosni i Hercegovini, da se pokrene baš na taj način, jer ostalo nam je samo ono što otmemo od investitora i gladnih pojedinaca koji su jednostavno javna dobra počeli da uzurpiraju i koriste za vlastiti interes. Jednostavno ostao je samo taj način da na neki gerila način sačuvamo naše javno dobro.
So she might just said that there was this big event when a group of women was defending the bridge and basically preventing the building of this new plant on the river Kruščica, and they met actually such force and brutality. 23 people were arrested by the police just defending this bridge, out of which 22 were women. And this kind of brutality that they met from the police, etc., really was a wake-up call for, not just for them, but for many other small communities that are undergoing similar problems because of this brutal privatization of rivers, and where you basically have the so-called investors and the state or the local governments being basically the same circle the same circle of elites. And what I wanted to say is that, and what Maida said is that the only thing remaining to ordinary people when defending public goods is what we take away from these investors through guerrilla tactics. That is basically what she sees as really the most powerful weapon of ordinary people at the moment in Bosnia, considering how local governments and higher levels of government and the investors are behaving when it comes to what they're doing, basically, when it comes to water resources in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the moment.
Šta želim još da naglasim? Da je ovakvim aktivizmom jako se teško baviti, u mom slučaju kao ženi, kao majki, kao kćerki, kao nekom akademskom građaninu i osobi koja je društveno odgovorna i prije toga neke akcije i aktivizam pokretala, jeste da u zajednici koja je mala, daleko od većih gradova, izuzeta, gdje su pretežno žene neobrazovane, gdje pojam samog feminizma i načina ponašanja nekih određenih normi, nažalost, one nisu imale priliku da to i usvoje i da vide i da primjenu u svom životu. Jako je teško surađivati i tu se trostruko troši i vrijeme i energija, s tim da vi nemate vremena jer stalni napad investitora vam je dovoljno težak.
Basically, she might be saying how difficult it is to sustain these struggles in such small communities and keep women together, considering all the pressures, not just from the government and from the private investors, but also how much work you have to invest in bringing women together, considering all the patriarchal pressures that they are undergoing, and considering that actually in these small communities some sort of feminist outlook is quite rare amongst these women, and yet they come together and resist certain things. But basically connecting these ecological struggles with feminist concerns is quite difficult in these small communities where a lot of women are also although they are quite proactive, they're also maybe of low levels of education, but also because it is in a way quite patriarchal claiming, and it's dangerous also to claim for yourself, I think, that you're feminist. Ecological warrior on the ground against these big interests. So you have to I'm now adding this, you have to sometimes call things other names. Well, for them, I think, although we from the outside see this as a feminist struggle, it's not necessarily the way all people inside the movement, call it, or maybe are reluctant to call it, not neither.
Drugi neki problem koji je u Bosni i Hercegovini općenito zastupljen jeste ta neka naša manipulativna sredstva kojima se koristimo, dok je trom sistem, u našem slučaju sudovi jako sporo rješavaju ovakve stvari, donosi presude na koncesione ugovore, na neke dozvole i tako dalje, mi se umaramo. Ali u pokretu se obično involviraju i oni koji su u biti na strani investitora, na strani uništivača javnog dobra i prirode, i dobro involvirani u pokrete, vi jedva možete da raspoznate. Oni nagrizaju pokret godinu, 2, 3, 4, 5, to se razvodnjava i priča odlazi ili u drugom smjeru ili se uništava, dok neprijatelj strpljivo iscrpljuje i vremenom i resursima. I imate, to je obično na selima ovako ili malim tim ruralnim područjima, kao ženi, ono što sam ja doživjela, to su strašni pritisci. sramoćenje, provociranje, prijetnje, optužbe, razne nezgodne situacije gdje vas se stavlja i vas i vašu porodicu, u mom slučaju moje vlastito dijete, u jako tešku poziciju i tešku situaciju.
It is talking about the harms from within that actually are happening to the movement. Basically how the movement is being attacked from within, because people who are actually on the side of the investors infiltrate the movement. They crumble it from within. It's actually very difficult. It takes really a lot of time to realize who is actually the enemy and who is a friend inside the movement, especially considering what kind of corruption there is in legal system and trying to fight this battle through legal means. But she's talking about all sorts of like intentional mechanisms of exhaustion of both energies and time and resources that true activists, committed activists have, and how much personal harm they are undergoing because of really brutal and violent and malicious attacks on them, their family, in her case also her daughter, and also how with time the movement also gets kind of diluted because of all these internal tearing apart that happens from within the movement.
I željela bih još reći, iako je planetarno poznata naša borba za jednu malu rijeku koja je unazad 30 godina poprilično nestala, upravo smo krivi mi, ne niko drugi iz Sarajeva, Tuzle ili Zenice, već mi, jer smo dozvolili sebi da sami uđemo u taj začarani krug korupcije i nelegalne sječe šume, uništavanja. Kada smo shvatili da bi mogli i vodu, to je rijeka koja je izvorište u planini, koja i napaja ujedno Zenicu i Viteza, ali je i jedan taj neki dio nas, jer oni koji su rođeni i odrasli ovdje, ona je sasvim sigurno govorim da je ona dio nas. I kada smo shvatili da bi mogla biti ucijevljena ili nestati totalno, onda smo se i uplašili. Aktivizam sa strahom donosi dobre rezultate.
Basically, it's just a comment on how ordinary people have already been, because of poverty and the conditions that are there locally, have been involved in this cycle of exploitation of natural resources slowly, and only like in the like illegal cutting down the woods and so forth, and only later on in the process, after 30 years of continuous damage after the war, when it happened locally in the region, suddenly I think local people became fearful because they realized they could lose this river, which means life, not only to them locally, but also to the areas of Zenica and Vitez. But it's, you know, the story is really complicated because you're partly involved in this cycle of extraction and exploitation, and you're not completely, so to say, clean, but there is a certain point when local community realizes this is really detrimental what we are doing and we must stop it now. So, but fear is a good, is a productive catalyst for these kinds of wake-up calls.
Ja znam da se u mojoj zajednici nisu nismo se složili svi sa istim odlukama. Moj cilj je bio da se, iako smo doživjeli opstrukciju i strašne stvari upravo od organa upravljanja lokalne vlasti pa do kantona i federacije, ja sam ipak nekako zagovornik da mi trebamo koristiti zakonske alate veoma ozbiljno, rigorozno, dok uporno branimo rijeku. I da ovaj slučaj nekako privučemo i osmilimo obrazovane mlade ljude iz lokalne zajednice, pa čak i grada cijele opštine. To je neophodno. Ja znam veliki je to problem zato što oni ne smiju zbog svoje egzistencije, zbog politika, zbog podijeljenosti. Još jedno breme koje nosimo jeste da je vitez nacionalno podijeljen. I to je jako teško sve držati bilo i bit će u jednom konceptu te priče, zato što uvijek imate te involvirane ili sa strane onima kojima se ne sviđamo ili investitorima. Imaju alat, jak alat, da ako vide neku Tanju ili Sanju, da kažu, a šta je ona došla u muslimansko selo. Ako vide bilo koju osobu koja je možda bila nekada politički eksponirana i bavila se nekom politikom, zagovarala neke politike, isto bi tako ove druge koje vladaju dvije mogle da imaju alat da tako urušavaju ovu borbu.
Prevešću ovo, pa ćemo onda malo diskusiju da otvorimo i da čujemo što drugi kažu, odnosno što kaže Stefania. Okay, so just a few more things that Minda brought up is like how to encourage young people to get involved, especially considering all the pressures, the fears that are actually experiencing, that they have for a good reason to get involved. Her method, her thinking is that the movement should rigorously use all kinds of legal ways and methods to achieve the defense of this river. But this has to be also a model to somehow mobilize other young people, which is a huge challenge, especially in a community such as Vitez, where you, apart from all these problems that she already mentioned with investors and local government, you also have the ethnic divisions. It is an ethnically divided community, and then you have that layer as well of complication of difficulties when trying to navigate such terrain as a movement trying to defend public good. And I think and then we agree that we are going to now kind of go back to you now having been introduced to something that's probably very close to you and your experience in both activist and theoretical, and also for the discussion. So, okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Maida. This was a very interesting and rich case that you talked about, and it's not like I have recipes on answers on to say do this, do that, and it's not what I'm here for. I just learning from you about this place which I had never heard before about, but some of the things that you were saying resonate a little bit with things that are common to other contexts as well. For example, the police violence against the protesters, but specifically targeting the women. This we have seen in research. There's in research in political ecology, in feminist political ecology, and environmental justice. There are many examples of this. So I think that this has to do with the fact that women's mobilization is particularly problematic, perhaps, no? Because it challenges also authority about who is the subject of politics, who is entitled to do politics, to take action, no? And also in other cases, I don't know in your case, but in other cases, women were also a bit isolated within their community because their struggle was somehow was aimed at defending their own access to the land, for example, no, and their own position within the community. So the men in the community sometimes were actually in favor of the development project or the mining project or whatever, because it would bring jobs, it would bring money, it could generate some income in the community, whereas the women are usually those that get excluded from because they don't get a job in the construction, they don't get a job in the mine, they don't get jobs in general, in good jobs. They might get jobs as prostitutes, which happens very often when these new development projects come to communities bringing workers from outside. Or they might get jobs as servicing, no? Servicing or cleaning or this kind of jobs. So it's not particularly interesting compared to what they lose in the process. In peasant and rural and indigenous communities, what women lose is a lot. They get to lose access to means of subsistence which are essential for them, and for their dependent, for example, children or elderly people that they take care of. So there is this division of labor also that locates women against development projects and men more, more ambiguously positioned. And this is a division internal in the community. And so, as you were mentioning before, there's also this problem of divisions within the community. But maybe I can stop here if you wanted to translate, Yasmina.
Yes, I think so. I think it's really important for us to kind of share the kind of things that ecofeminist circles or those that are involved in what I would term as ecofeminist initiatives are experiencing at the moment in Bosnia. So we are actually since last year in this intensive dialogue between various initiatives and women's initiatives and women's organizations that have been involved in ecological issues in this or that sense. And in the last meeting that we had, we agreed to create a platform called EcoFem Bosnia and Herzegovina, and hopefully we'll have a first meeting live, not just meeting online, but in Viva in Tuzla in October. So it would be, I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of new lines of cooperation happen once we have these various activists. Some are more some are between academia and activism, some are activists and in NGO sector, some are also somehow involved in art, but they are all committed to ecological justice, and in that sense I'm excited, and that's why it's it's really important also to have you and that we talk about these issues, and we'll have it as part of our work on ecofeminist, not just knowledge production, but also activism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but in this kind of collaborative sense where we start to talk about these things and share these issues and share burdens and act together a bit more, because it is really vital for us, I think, to collectivize some of our struggles and some of our, and basically also the grunt of the concerns together. So I think the key issue for me, and what you also brought to the fore, is how you have these pressures of violence and proletarization, as you said. So how do you sustain this collectivization of women's struggles for the common good? I think that is our key question, and one of the key questions also of our Workers' University as a platform and other platforms that we have, which is how do we work together? How do we also fight together for the public good in ecological terms? So that is a comment that I had. Is there anyone else who'd like to get involved in the discussion?
Well, one thing I was thinking is that perhaps ecofeminist as a label, it's a bit difficult, no? And also Maida was mentioning at the beginning that these women in this movement, they don't see themselves as ecofeminists, perhaps not even as feminists, no? Because claiming that you are a feminist, it means challenging a lot of male power and in the community, in a situation which is already violent and complicated. You don't want to add up even more conflict and difficulty, right? So and sometimes these women, especially in rural contexts, they have never heard about feminism. They don't even know what the word means, because often feminism has been a white middle class movement, no? And so one of the things that are interesting for me about ecofeminism is the fact that it's much more rural and it's much more diverse. It's actually very much made of women of color and peasant women, who are the subjects that are less represented in white middle class feminism. So there is a substantial difference, and this is also why a lot of feminists were criticizing ecofeminists. I think that you can understand that with the class and also urban versus rural divide. So today, for example, the movement, the Via Campesina, also Via Campesina Europe, has been developing feminist, peasant feminism and rural feminism as a line of struggle within the movement. So within the peasant movement, getting the peasant women and their struggles a specific acknowledgement of their situation, of their work, and of their struggle, and of their subjectivity within the peasant movement. And I think this is important because it helps also, I think it helps connect with environmental justice, ecofeminist struggles, because these communities are very often, they are rural communities. No, I think the community that you're talking about, it's you didn't say, but I figured it was a rural community.
This was Žene Kruščice is a rural community, but inside this movement we have a mix of urban and rural women's initiatives. I mean, we are talking about the network that we are bringing together, so there will be.
Yeah, I understand that the
varieties,
network. I understand that is much more about different movements coming together and supporting each other, no? But I mean, I'm a material mobilize people. It's not as mobilizing somebody else. The point is to understand the material conditions that people people are embedded in their lives, and starting from there to understand what are their material interests and what is standing opposite to their own realization of their own potential, you know, but starting from their own situation. So the difficulty here is that in rural communities, there is a lot, when development projects come, they introduce divisions because, of course, there's a process of commodification. There's money thrown into the community, and people wanted to divide in the community between those that want to defend the land or the commons, and those that want to get access to the money. And you know, so I think that this is the basic conflict that that we have to understand in these situations, and the fact that this conflict is very often gendered, because yeah, as I was saying before, women are often those who won't get advantages from the development project. And yeah.
Damit?
Hi, Stefania. It's always a pleasure to listen to you and to be able to dialogue with you. I'm wondering, actually, to what extent does this notion of good life that you talk about kind of affirm this different vision that stands against this polarization between the separation of human and non-human natures, or that what is this kind of good life that opposes proletarization? So how do you see it embodied? Because, you know, I've been thinking about a lot in terms of how difficult it is theoretically and also practically to think about how the struggle for personal property could be emancipatory, right? And, you know, in certain cases it is, but it seems to me it could only be emancipatory if it's couched in very strong anti-capitalist vocabularies and practices. Otherwise, it can always be commodified and brought back into the thing, you know, into this kind of exchanges of money, commodity, and money, right? So what is this notion of good life that is helpful to you? Because to me it's still kind of unclear from literature. It circulates around as a concept, you know, but I can see how it could be very problematic, and it's still a bit fuzzy, you know, what is good in good life, you know, and who is it good for, etc., you know.
Yeah, thanks, Damir. I mean, good life is a concept that comes from Latin American and specifically indigenous thinking and struggles, and it goes also by the name of Sumac Causai. So from communities, especially indigenous communities in Ecuador and Bolivia. And it means the good life means a life that is, I would say, a life that is not objectified, a life that is connected, and development of the human potential that is connected to the non-human world. So the good life is rejecting this hyper separation that Western modernity has imposed between the human and the non-human, the development and the wealth of humans and the wealth of non-human nature. And so seeing non-human nature as instrumental, and also seeing human beings themselves as, and their work as instrumental to and the economy, no? So the good life is rejecting all this and is proposing a notion of well-being in which nobody is objectified, and nobody and nothing is objectified and instrumentalized to some superior end. And so it's life itself is the measure of good in the good life. Yeah, so this means that you do not objectify the land, and you see your humanity, human beingness, as a part of a larger being, which is the ecological and which is the earth, no? And where everything is connected. Oh, now I don't know how much this can be automatically transposed to different contexts and different traditions and different struggles as well. No, of course there are many things in common when it comes to struggles for the commons especially in rural areas. No. But then there are also many differences, because of course in the indigenous communities there's a whole history not common to other contexts, no? So I mean, I would say the good life is something that that we can learn from and try to yeah, I would say learn in the sense of including this language and this different way of conceptualizing human on human relations as opposite to Western habits of thought that we are embedded in, no? So it's a way of provincializing and relativizing our own habits of thought, and also our own ways of seeing politics and political struggle and everything, and consider that there might be other ways, no, of seeing things. I don't know if this answers your question.
Sure does. Thank you.
Seems to me that it is, if we are following this kind of thread against commodification of everything, it is also about particular kind of self-realization in work and politics, both following the Marxist also thread in thinking good life, so going away from passive consumption or the logic of privatization and commodification everywhere, but it is basically how, you know, what does it mean to be like these naturally productive sociable beings today, fulfilled in a way when it comes to both work and politics today, because I think it's somehow both,
yeah, I mean, the issue, the problematization that I wanted to introduce in this talk was, against romanticized vision of commoning and struggles for the commons, which sometimes come from an urban middle class position, no? So white scholars, academics who have a salary, not always a good salary, but still a salary, and perhaps urban life, and write about commoning in rural communities as this romanticized other, no? And to me, this is problematic in the sense that in these commoning struggles, there are internal asymmetries and internal asymmetries, and there is violence within communities. One of the things that struck me, for example, in one of my graduate students researching anti-mining movements in Ecuador, is the domestic violence, the rate of domestic violence that is so high in these communities. And so the women of these communities that are struggling against the mining company, at the same time, they are subject to violence from their own, within their own community, from the other members of the community, who sometimes are also struggling against the mining company or for the commons. So how do we make sense, no, of these differences and of these power relations? This I think is a problem. It's a difficult problem. And what Veena Agarwal, which I recently discovered, of course, she's very famous, but I had never read her work because I thought it was, about things that were not related to feminist political ecology, but in fact it is. And she makes a very interesting point. She makes it very clear that for women, access to individual property in land is also the single most important, for rural women, the single most important way to protect themselves from dispossession and proletarization and violence within their own communities and within their own households, and a way also to provide for the children and other dependent people, and a way also she's also writing about how these women's farming has been also ecologically more sustainable compared to male farming, because women give more importance to the preservation of the land itself, for themselves and for the future generations. So for them, land is not acquiring individual property over land doesn't mean commodification of land. So, sometimes we make this automatic, like once, like in Orthodox Marxism, the peasants were the enemy, were the petty capitalists that, were to be eliminated by all means, no? So, I mean, sometimes Marxist theory has this, rigidities that if you see things from the perspective of either women or peasants or transgender people, so the subjects that were not included in the classic industrial worker subjectivity, if you see things from these perspectives, that helps you to also deconstruct some rigidity some theoretical rigidities, and understanding that individual property over land doesn't necessarily mean or lead to commodification. So I think that this is what this is the element of problematization that I wanted to introduce. It's not just about common property, common lands on one side, and which is good, and private property, or automatically the international market or corporations or capital on the other hand. It's not like that. There are, you know, property can be an emancipatory concept if it's seen from the perspective of oppressed people. And the same goes to the body, for example, no? And it's very clear, no? Having full ownership of your own body, even against traditional understandings of the body, of sexuality, etc. It's also the body is also, it's not just your individual property. The body can also be a means of production or reproduction. Yeah, so this is also challenging of rigid distinctions, and money also, it's another taboo for commoning discourse conversations where it seems like, you know, we don't touch money. We don't.
Yeah, precisely. I think you're on the point. You know, commoning discussions and discourse. You know, commoning performance, but not, you know, not that is not necessarily politics. What happens in the politics of commoning is something. I mean, it happens in real life, and it's different from, you know, from the discourse that we have, academic discourse on commoning, where there are all these problems that you already mentioned, and it is something that I think in general a lot of left and feminist circles, especially in the West, have the luxury to perpetuate. And maybe also misidentify for like emancipatory politics. Which,
yeah.
I mean, we are close to the end of our session today, but I would really like to use this opportunity to invite you, Stefania, to come to Bosnia and hopefully meet all these initiatives and women activists in different places, or maybe we get to work on something together. That would be really exciting. I'm looking forward to that. I'm hopeful when it comes to not only sharing our knowledge, but also being involved in some proper political work academically, but also in terms of ecological justice in Bosnia and the region. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That would be lovely.
Yes, it would be great. Maybe you can come in October. I know that you would not be traveling, but who knows? Who knows? Maybe you could be our guest. I mean, well, we're still trying to find means for, you know, to do that.
Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Stefania.
This was a great conversation.
Thank you. Yes.
Be continued.
To be continued.
And I'm really looking forward to your new book. When is it coming out?
Sometime hopefully in 2023.
Hopefully. Okay. Yes, and I'm looking forward to receiving your text, which we will translate, so it will be available to all the theorists and activists in the region.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
No, we are really happy that we can do that. Great, fantastic. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Yes, you too. Thank you.